David Blackwell was a man who seemed to have it all. Born in a small town in Ohio, he rose to prominence in high school as a star football player. With a strong frame, a sharp mind, and an easygoing charm, he attracted the attention of college scouts and earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university. He was the pride of his family, a symbol of what hard work and ambition could achieve. After graduating, David entered the world of finance, a field that matched his sharp intellect and desire for success. Within a few years, he landed a job at a top financial firm in downtown Chicago. His rise was meteoric. He quickly became one of the firm's youngest rising stars. He was driven by the belief that wealth was not just a symbol of success, but a measure of his worth. His ability to predict market trends made him popular with clients, and soon David had built an impressive portfolio. Clients trusted him, relying on his advice for everything from retirement savings to risky investment opportunities. David enjoyed the lifestyle that came with his success. His city apartment was a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. He drove a black luxury car and frequently dined at the finest restaurants in the city. His life appeared perfect. However, beneath the polished exterior, David was struggling. The pressure to maintain his high-flying lifestyle was mounting, and the stakes were growing higher with every passing year. What began as a desire to secure a comfortable future slowly morphed into an obsession with maintaining appearances. As his colleagues bought second homes and upgraded to even more lavish cars, David felt the weight of comparison. He was determined to keep up with them, no matter the cost. But in the volatile world of finance, even the most seasoned investors face risks, and David's portfolio took a sharp downturn. It was subtle at first, small losses here and there, but they added up over time. Instead of taking a step back and reevaluating his approach, David's fear of losing his status pushed him further into the red. Rather than admit his failures, he doubled down. He started using the funds from one account to cover the losses in another. Then he began siphoning off small amounts of money from his clients' investments to cover the shortfalls in his own. At first, it was a few $1,000s here and there, nothing that anyone would notice. The money would be replaced with profits from other deals, and David would keep the scheme hidden. But as the losses grew larger, so did his desperation. Soon, the amounts he was taking became harder to cover. David rationalized his actions. He convinced himself that he was only borrowing the money temporarily. He thought he could pay it back once the next big deal went through. But as each day passed, the borrowed amounts grew, and the lies became more difficult to manage. David started creating fake accounts, hiding funds in offshore investments, and using creative accounting tricks to cover up his tracks. The people who had trusted him with their savings had no idea that the man they thought was helping them was stealing from them instead. What David didn't realize was that greed had begun to erode his moral compass. He had once been driven by ambition, but now he was driven by fear. Fear of losing everything he had worked for. The once proud man who had built a reputation for success was now trapped in a web of lies. And the harder he worked to cover up his misdeeds, the deeper he sank into the shadows of his own creation. The trial of David Blackwell was a media sensation. The fall of a high-flying financial star from grace was the kind of story that captivated the public. The courtroom was packed each day with reporters, curious onlookers, and victims who had trusted him with their life savings. The question on everyone's mind was how someone like David, who had it all, wealth, status, and a seemingly bright future, could end up facing federal charges for embezzling millions of dollars. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the prosecution laid out its case. David's defense, however, was an attempt at humanizing a man who had become a symbol of corporate greed. His lawyer painted a picture of a man under immense pressure, overwhelmed by the demands of his career and personal life. They argued that David had never intended to hurt anyone. He was simply caught in a spiral of bad investments and mounting personal debt. And the money he took was, in his mind, just a temporary fix. According to the defense, David had always planned to repay what he owed, but no one seemed to buy that explanation. The evidence was too overwhelming, too clear to ignore. David's spreadsheets, once carefully constructed to show promising returns, had been manipulated to conceal the losses. The fake accounts, the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, all were laid bare for the jury to see. The prosecution had a much simpler narrative. David Blackwell had stolen from people who trusted him, people who had worked hard for their money and believed in his expertise. The victims, some elderly, others struggling to save for their children's education, sat in the courtroom with their faces filled with disbelief and anger. Many had invested their life savings with David, believing he had their best interests at heart. Instead, they found themselves left with nothing, their futures compromised by the greed of the man they had trusted. Among the victims was Linda Roberts, a woman who had invested her retirement fund into David's care, only to find herself nearing bankruptcy in her late 60s. She was just one of many whose life had been shattered by David's deception. The prosecution presented witness after witness, each with their own horror story of how David had stolen from them. One victim, a young couple, had put all their savings into a college fund for their daughter, only to discover that the money had vanished into thin air. Another elderly man, who had been looking forward to retiring with peace of mind, found himself working at a part-time job well past his 70th birthday, just to make ends meet. As these victims told their stories, David's once composed demeanor started to crack. He sat silently, occasionally glancing at the floor, as the weight of their pain and anger seemed to sink in. The damage he had done was irreversible, and it was becoming painfully clear that his actions had not only harmed his clients financially, but had destroyed their sense of trust and security as well. When it came time for David to testify, he seemed like a man who had been broken. The defense tried to elicit sympathy by painting him as someone who was overwhelmed by the pressures of his success and the mounting personal troubles he faced. They spoke of his mounting debts, the pressure to keep up appearances, and his fear of losing everything. But it was clear that his attempt to humanize himself didn't resonate with the jury. The victims weren't looking for excuses. They were looking for accountability. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict was swift and inevitable, guilty on all counts. The weight of the evidence, the testimonies of the victims, and the undeniable truth of David's actions left the jury with no choice. David Blackwell was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The sentence was a brutal blow to David, who had spent the entirety of his adult life climbing the corporate ladder, chasing wealth and status. Now he was facing a future behind bars, with no chance of regaining the life he had once known. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and anger. For some, it was the closure they needed after years of financial ruin. For David, it was the beginning of an entirely new chapter, a chapter in which he would no longer be the man in control, but the man stripped of everything he had once held dear. David's transition from the courtroom to the prison cell was a brutal awakening, a stark contrast to the world he had known just weeks before. The bright lights of corporate success, The power of boardrooms and the luxury of designer suits were replaced by the cold, dimly lit corridors of a maximum security prison. He was no longer a man in control, the one who made decisions, called the shots, and moved in circles of influence. Now, he was just another inmate in a sea of criminals, each one with their own story, their own struggles, and their own fight for survival. The first few days were overwhelming. He was placed in a general population unit where the reality of prison life hit him hard. The guards were distant, cold, and uninterested in the stories of white-collar criminals like David. In the eyes of the prisoners, he wasn't a former financial advisor. He was just another inmate. And in their world, he had no more worth than anyone else. His status in the outside world meant nothing now. If anything, it made him a target. David quickly learned that in prison, respect wasn't earned through wealth or success. It was earned through survival, toughness, and alliances, and he had none of those. For someone who had spent his life managing portfolios and numbers, David was ill-prepared for the harsh, unforgiving world of violence and intimidation that defined prison life. On his first night, he was woken by the sound of loud banging on the cell bars, followed by shouts and profanity from the inmates in the hallways. The constant noise, the threats, and the smell of stale food and sweat made it difficult for David to sleep. Every minute felt like an eternity. The first few weeks were the hardest. David was the target of ridicule and abuse. His wealth and status in the outside world meant nothing to the other prisoners, many of whom viewed him with contempt. To them, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, a man who had stolen from the very people he was supposed to protect. As a white-collar criminal, David was treated with disdain. He was seen as weak, a rat, a man who had destroyed the lives of hard-working individuals for personal gain. David tried to keep a low profile, avoiding trouble whenever possible. He spent most of his time reading books or staring blankly at the walls of his tiny cell. He had no friends, no allies, and no one to turn to. The other inmates kept their distance, sizing him up with suspicion and hostility. There were always whispers in the hallways, and David couldn't help but feel the weight of their eyes on him. Each day he wondered if someone would make him their next target, whether it would be a fist or a shiv, but he knew it was inevitable. It wasn't long before he was involved in his first altercation. It started over something small, a comment from a fellow inmate who had heard about David's financial crimes. That comment quickly escalated into a physical confrontation, one that left David bruised and bloodied in a corner of the prison yard. He hadn't fought back, and that only made him look weaker in the eyes of the others. In the weeks that followed, David learned how to survive. He started to adapt, picking up on the unspoken rules of the prison. He learned to avoid certain areas, stay out of the way of powerful gang leaders, and never, under any circumstances, show fear. But even then, his place in the prison's brutal hierarchy was uncertain. His status as a financial thief didn't give him any street cred, and he quickly realized that his prior life was irrelevant here. In prison, the only currency that mattered was survival. David's worst fears were confirmed when he encountered a gang of inmates who specialized in exploiting white-collar criminals. Their leader, Tony the Boss Martinez, had a reputation for using men like David to do his bidding, manipulating them for whatever goods or services he could extract. David, once an ambitious and powerful man in the financial world, now found himself a pawn in a far more dangerous game. He had no choice but to comply with their demands, or face worse violence. Each day was a constant struggle for David, not just physically, but mentally. The prison system was a world built on fear, and David had to constantly watch his back. He had gone from the man who made the rules to the one who had to obey them. And with every passing day, David began to wonder if the man he had been, the successful financial advisor, the one who had risen so high, was truly gone for good. It was hard to imagine a way out of this new life. The man he had once been was fading, and all that was left was the raw, unfiltered reality of life behind bars. 2 years into David's sentence, his sense of hopelessness was beginning to solidify. The prison, once a terrifying unknown, had become his reality. Every day he woke up to the same harsh routines, the clanging of metal doors, the sterile food trays, the endless hours spent in his small, dimly lit cell. The oppressive nature of prison life wore him down mentally and physically. But it was during these dark, monotonous days that an unexpected figure approached him. Marcus had a reputation in the prison, one that intrigued David as much as it unsettled him. A former hacker and cybercriminal, Marcus had spent years manipulating systems, dodging law enforcement, and building networks of influence within the prison walls. Unlike David, who had been a prisoner of his own financial schemes, Marcus had always operated in the shadows, out of sight, out of mind. But he was no stranger to surviving in an unforgiving environment, and he saw something in David that others did not. A man with knowledge, a man who could be useful. At first, David was skeptical. He had been the target of manipulation before, and he wasn't keen on getting involved in anything that could make his situation worse. But Marcus wasn't the type of man to be easily dismissed. He approached David with an offer that seemed too good to pass up. Use his financial skills to help certain inmates with laundering money. In exchange, Marcus promised him protection from the gangs that had tormented him for so long. It wasn't a path David wanted to take, but it was the only option that offered him a sliver of control over his situation. The idea of gaining favor with Marcus and his associates was tempting. The gang leaders had made it clear that David was nothing but a target, someone they could exploit. But Marcus, with his knowledge of the underground workings of the prison, promised a way out, at least a way to survive. David knew that without protection, he wouldn't last much longer. His isolation was taking its toll, and the constant fear of violence was more than he could bear. He was desperate, willing to grasp at any lifeline, no matter how dubious. As weeks passed, David began to assist Marcus with setting up money laundering schemes within the prison. It started small, using prison labor to work on menial tasks while laundering small amounts of money through untraceable means. But soon, as David's reputation spread, the scale of the operations grew. Inmates, particularly those involved in the black market within the prison, became aware of his expertise. His financial background was an asset, and he found himself pulled deeper into the web of illicit activities. David was no longer the weak, isolated figure he had been when he first arrived. He had power now, or at least a semblance of it. Marcus ensured that no one messed with him. In exchange, David helped manage complex financial transactions, setting up accounts and moving money through various channels. Though he had once dreamed of leaving this world behind, he now realized that this was his new reality. The man who had once managed multi-million-dollar portfolios was now laundering cash for dangerous men who had nothing to lose. Yet, as David's involvement in the scheme grew, so did his awareness of the danger surrounding it. Marcus had never been interested in simple financial transactions. His ambitions were much larger. As the operation expanded, Marcus began hinting at a more audacious plan: an escape. He had been studying the prison's security measures, noting every weakness, every blind spot. He wanted out, and he wanted David's help. The plan was a risky one, involving stolen keys, timed distractions, and bribes. many of which would have to come from the money they were laundering. David, now ensnared in this dangerous game, didn't know what to think. On the one hand, the idea of escaping the suffocating walls of the prison was tempting. The thought of freedom, even under a new identity, was like a beacon in the darkness. On the other hand, he knew that being caught would mean more than just a longer sentence. It would mean a life sentence, perhaps even death at the hands of the powerful men who had placed their trust in him. David found himself trapped once again, this time by a promise that seemed impossible to ignore. He had spent his entire life making decisions, calculating risks and weighing the rewards. But now, in the underworld of prison, the stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences were no longer just about money. This time, they were about his very survival, and as Marcus laid out the details of the escape plan, David had to decide whether he would risk everything to escape, or whether he would remain, hidden in the shadows, doing what he could to survive the next day. The day of the escape arrived with a sense of tension that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. David had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and every part of the plan was etched into his mind. He had done everything Marcus asked, setting up the money laundering schemes, manipulating accounts, and moving the money around. In return, Marcus had kept his word, protecting him from the gangs and offering him a semblance of control over his otherwise chaotic life. But as the day of the escape drew nearer, David's anxiety grew. What he had once seen as an opportunity for freedom now felt like a terrifying gamble. Marcus had worked tirelessly to gather the resources needed for the escape. Bribes had been paid, distractions had been set in motion, and the keys, stolen from an unsuspecting guard, were ready to be used. The plan was simple enough. A distraction in one part of the prison would draw the attention of the guards, while Marcus and a small group of trusted inmates would make their move toward the perimeter. David, meanwhile, was tasked with the most dangerous part, ensuring that the financial transactions linked to the escape would go undetected. If they were caught, not only would they face punishment for the escape attempt, but the authorities would quickly unravel the web of money laundering they had been running. David had never felt more conflicted. The thought of freedom, the possibility of leaving this hellhole behind, was intoxicating. He could start over, shed the man he had been, and disappear into a new life. But as the hours ticked by, reality set in. If the plan failed, if even one detail went wrong, his life would be over. His sentence would be extended indefinitely, and the men who had helped him would exact their own brutal form of justice. He was in too deep now, and there was no turning back. As the escape began, everything seemed to move in slow motion. David sat in his cell, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the signal. The sound of shuffling feet in the hallway was muffled by the pounding in his ears. He had been instructed to stay put, not to make any moves until he received a text from Marcus, signaling that it was time. As he waited, he thought about everything he had lost, his career, his family, his freedom. All of it seemed so far away now. But it was the fear of what was to come that consumed him. Then the text came. It was short, direct. Go. David slipped out of his cell and moved quickly down the corridor, blending into the shadows. The prison was eerily quiet as the distraction Marcus had orchestrated took effect. Several inmates had caused a commotion in the mess hall, throwing food and shouting at the guards, forcing them to focus their attention on the chaos. David followed the plan as closely as possible, but his mind was racing. Every step felt like it might be his last. When he reached the designated exit point, the tension nearly broke him. He could hear footsteps approaching and froze in the darkened hallway. Time slowed as he stood, barely breathing, his heart thudding in his chest. The minutes felt like hours. He had never been more afraid in his life. And then, just as the footsteps passed, a guard called out from further down the hall. The escape was slipping out of reach. But then, miraculously, the guard turned and walked away. It was only a few more steps before David reached the outer perimeter, the last barrier between him and freedom. He had made it that far, but there was one last obstacle, a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It had seemed climbable in theory, but as David stood in front of it, reality hit him like a punch to the gut. He hesitated, wondering if he had the strength to make it over. He was exhausted. His body ached from the constant tension, and his mind was racing. But there was no time to waste. With a deep breath, David scaled the fence, using the thin gap between the wires to avoid being caught by the cameras above. His fingers scraped against the sharp edges of the metal, but he pushed through the pain. His heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that he thought for sure the guards could hear it. Every second felt like a lifetime. Just as David was about to drop down on the other side, he heard a distant shout. "He's escaping!" A guard's voice echoed through the yard. In that moment, everything fell apart. David hit the ground hard, rolling to his feet in a desperate sprint, but the sound of alarms began blaring throughout the compound. He could see the guards converging from all directions. It was over. The plan had failed. As David was tackled to the ground, the overwhelming sense of defeat consumed him. He had wanted so badly to escape, to leave behind the prison walls, the years of misery. But the price of his failure was immediate and severe. Within hours he was back in solitary confinement, stripped of all privileges and facing even more severe charges. The authorities pieced together the extent of the escape plan, uncovering the money laundering operation in the process. What followed was swift retribution. David's original 25-year sentence was extended, and additional charges were added for his involvement in the escape attempt. His hopes of freedom, of starting over, were crushed in an instant. David realized that in his desperate bid for control, he had sacrificed everything. The fleeting hope of a second chance, of redemption, was gone. The walls that once confined him now felt insurmountable, and he knew, without a doubt, that his life behind bars was no longer just a matter of years. It was a lifetime.